Hello, my name is Malin Grahn-Wilder. I'm a postdoctoral scholar here at the University of Jyväskylä, and today it's my great honor to welcome Professor Marguerite Deslauriers. Thank you for being here, Marguerite.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. And Marguerite is a professor of philosophy at the McKeen University and an international expert on the philosophies of Aristotle and other ancient thinkers, as well as the Renaissance feminists and adaptations of ancient thinking in the Renaissance period. And she's an author of several books and articles, such as the Aristotle on Sexual Difference, Metaphysics, Biology, Politics, which came out from the Oxford University Press in 2022. And this spring term of 2024, Marguerite has been a visiting scholar here at the University of Jyväskylä, which has been a great pleasure for us having you here. Could you first tell us a little bit about the research you have conducted here in Jyväskylä?
Sure, I'm happy to. I'm working on a project with Martina Reuter on continuities in feminist arguments from the medieval period through the Renaissance and into the early modern period. So Martina and I are collaborating because she's more an expert in 17th, 18th century philosophy, and my expertise is in these earlier periods. And our working hypothesis for the project is that despite the view many people hold that feminism started in 1963, in fact, of course, there's a much longer history to feminist arguments, and more than that, that we can find discussions, debates, and arguments that recur through that history. So to give you some examples, one question that feminists have been concerned about for a very long time is the question of the equality of men and women, whether in fact the two sexes are equal or not. Some feminists historically argue for the superiority of women over men, and others, of course, insist on equality. So that's one theme that we think provides some continuity. Another is the question of the innate capacities of men and women and the extent to which education forms those capacities. So again, of course, there were misogynists who believed that women's capacities were quite different from men's, and lots of the feminists are arguing that that is not the case. Again, either that men and women have equal capacities, or in some cases, that women have superior capacities. A third theme we're interested in is the relation between bodies and minds in these philosophical debates, because often when people, well, actually, both misogynists and feminists often base their arguments on claims about the body, that the sexed body produces certain psychological features in both men and women that makes them well suited for certain tasks, is the general view. The feminists, of course, are arguing that the particular physiology of women's bodies is actually an advantage to them, and the misogynists arguing against that. And the fourth of the examples of these continuities that we have identified so far is around the question of political rule. So from very early on in the history of feminist arguments, women are arguing or suggesting that they are capable not only of governing themselves, of autonomy and moral agency, but also capable of governing other people. So that's the larger project that I've been working on here. And it's been a pleasure, I have to say, to meet various people working in the department, some people in medieval philosophy, some of the PhD students and postdocs. So there's a real sense here of a kind of liveliness of discussion in the history of philosophy and an interest in it, which is great for me.
Thank you. I recently had the pleasure of hearing one of your more recent research papers at the Department of Philosophy Research Seminar entitled Sexual Difference in Natural Character, the Reception of Aristotle's Biology in the Renaissance, which is related to the topics you just mentioned of your ongoing project. So this paper, I found it highly interesting, and you were discussing this querelle des femmes, which was ultimately a debate on women's worth and status and nature. Maybe you can soon tell us a little bit more about this debate. But one specific topic in your conversation that I found highly interesting was the central value given to the discussion of natural temperatures, right? This argument that Aristotle had presented in his biology, that women are naturally colder and men or male sex is naturally warmer than the female sex. And I found it extremely interesting that the conversation concerning the natural temperatures was so central to the early feminist and misogynist arguments. So could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Maybe I'll start by saying something about the querelle des femmes, which, what we would say in English is it's a debate about women. And really the question was, what's the nature of women? What kind of thing are women? And what's their worth? So on the debate, I'll say a few things about it because I think it's important for understanding the debate around Aristotle. So the querelle des femmes starts really in the 14th century when Christine de Pizan is responding to what she took to be a misogynist text, the Roman de la Rose. And it extends at least until the late 16th century into the 17th, in my opinion, at least. And I think it's important that both men and women are contributing to this debate, particularly on the side of the feminists. The pro-woman side includes men and women writing things to argue for the worth of women. The misogynists are mostly men. And the other thing it's important to say is that the contributions to the debate were mostly non-academic. So they were not written in universities for scholars. They were often presented first in an oral form in courts. They circulated in manuscript. Sometimes the texts were printed and discussed in the sort of intellectual organizations, for example, in Italy, the academies. So one thing that interests me about these texts is that they are popular works for an educated audience, but not university texts. And that means that they are intended to be entertaining and stimulating and not just instructive. And then, well, maybe that's enough about the querelle des femmes. So Aristotle, and one of the particular debates within this larger debate about the nature and worth of women concerns what affects women's physiology, their physical constitution, has on their moral and intellectual capacities. So Aristotle had claimed, as had many other ancient philosophers, as you know, that women are by nature colder than men, and that has certain effects on their bodies, but also possibly on their minds, as we would say. So the interesting thing to me is that both the misogynists and the pro-women authors of the Renaissance take for granted this claim that women, they do not dispute the claim that women are colder than men. And I should add that Aristotle saw that, and these Renaissance authors agree, that that's the fundamental physical difference between men and women, is this difference in temperature. What's interesting in the Renaissance is that the misogynists are clearly trying to represent the coldness of women as nothing but a defect. It makes them somehow less capable, and particularly less well suited for practical deliberation, so for thinking about moral and political issues, and it also makes them less intellectually astute, according to the misogynists. The Renaissance feminists turn that around, and what's interesting to me is that they do it by drawing on Aristotle. So their claim is, true, women are colder than men, but you misogynists, you completely misunderstand things if you think that that's a defect, because the cooler temperatures of women, most importantly, mean that they are less enslaved to their passions and their appetites. They are cooler-headed, better able, in fact, to deliberate about moral and political matters. And because their passions don't get in the way, they're also more intellectually capable. So again, what's interesting to me is the way in which a kind of empirical claim about body temperature as a fundamental distinguishing feature of the sexes is then used by the misogynists to argue for the inferiority of women, and used by the pro-woman authors to argue for, in fact, the superior capabilities of women across a range of activities. I think that as sort of background to the discussion about cold and heat, it might be helpful to say more generally that Aristotle is very much invoked by the misogynists as an authority for the claim that women are defective, that there's something wrong with it, that they are imperfect persons, whereas men are perfect examples of a human being. And there are texts in Aristotle that suggest that the female is defective in some ways, although I think they are often misinterpreted in some ways. But the feminists, the pro-woman contributors to the querelle can also invoke Aristotle, because he also said, along with saying that the female is defective, he also said, but men and women have to have the same species essence. So they have the same soul, and in particular, they have to both have a rational soul. Because Aristotle understood that if he denied that, he would be denying that women and men were of the same species, and he thought that there were unacceptable consequences to that view. But that becomes really important in the Renaissance to the pro-woman authors, because they can cling to this idea that if men and women have the same rational soul, then we are, in every important way, the same. And in particular, can expect to have the same, the same moral capabilities, because those are founded on reason, and also the same expectation of life after death, assuming that we are, assuming that we do the things that will allow us to gain this life after death. So that's the background to the debate about coldness.
Another central topic that you took up in your presentation that I found extremely interesting was the relevance of body hairs. And it might not seem obvious for the contemporary philosophical readers that body hair should be a topic of serious philosophical consideration, but the ancient and Renaissance thinkers seem to disagree on that. They seem to take body hairs as a serious philosophical topic, and also the hairs seem to be important in the texts that you were analyzing in your presentation. So could you tell us why hairs?
Yes. I also, when I was first reading the Renaissance works, and hair kept coming up, and I thought, why would they be interested in this? And why would it seem to them that patterns of hair on a body might tell us something about the worth of people? So, in fact, this does, once again, the Renaissance authors are drawing on ancient debates, not only in Aristotle, who does have things to say about, in particular, again, about body temperature and the way that produces in men who are hotter certain distinctive patterns of hair growth. So Aristotle traces the beards of men and the baldness of men to this elevated body temperature that he thinks they have. And then the smooth faces of women, of course, become attributable, on his view, to their colder temperatures. But along with Aristotle, there's in the ancient medical traditions, so both in the Hippocratic texts and in Galen, we find claims about temperature, hair, and sex, where these things are the different temperatures of the sexes produce these distinctive patterns of hair growth on the body. So in the Renaissance, the pro-woman authors are remarking on all of those ancient traditions, sometimes very explicitly mentioning them, also drawing on physiognomy, because they took the work that we now believe is pseudo-Aristotle. They took it to be Aristotle. So this is an ancient work about physiognomy that suggests that certain features of a body reveal to anyone who observes them accurately the moral and intellectual character of the person, often tying those to the appearance of certain animals and the character of those animals as understood by these people. So the idea then is temperature produces these distinctive patterns of hair growth or hair loss in men and women, and that is caused by, and so a symptom of, the body temperature of men and women, the difference between it. But then the interesting thing they do is say, moreover, this hair growth is not just due to certain physiological differences between the sexes, but it's also a sign of moral differences between them and differences in character between them. And this is where the animals become important, because the pro-woman authors argue that if men have beards, that means they have hair on their faces. And what we know is animals have hair on their faces. And that suggests, and animals are more ferocious, more hostile, more aggressive, and also less constrained by reason than people are. If men resemble animals with respect to their hair patterns, that should lead us to believe that the characters of men are more like animals, where that means more bestial, more irrational, more violent, and that women, by contrast, who are, according to the Renaissance authors, more beautiful, one sign of their beauty is the luxurious hair on the heads of women. That should also lead us to believe that the characters of women are more beautiful, are less violent, actually more reasonable, more driven by rational considerations and concern for others, and so less like animals. And one thing that I think is especially important about this debate is so many of the misogynists were coming close to saying that women were not really human beings, but more like animals. That this is a kind of lighthearted way, these discussions of hair are a kind of lighthearted way for the pro-woman authors to say, look, in fact, it's a scientific fact that women don't have beards. That means they're less like animals and not more like animals. So there's a kind of interplay between learning and an appeal to ancient authorities, and also what I take to be an attempt to be funny and to be interesting, right? Let's talk about beards and luxuriant hair and not just about abstract matters. So that's the hair conversation.
I find it interesting that both hairs and the assumptions of natural differences in the body temperature, the coldness and hotness, are relevant not only for the history of gender, but also for the history of what later became conceptualized as race. And you already mentioned the medical traditions of Hippocrates and Galen. And in this tradition, we can see that the qualities of cold and hot, as well as dry and wet, were used to denote not only differences between the sexes, but also between groups of people coming from different regions. So in Galen, for example, the argument would go something like this, that because of the climate, a region affects mixture, of which he used the term krasis. So it affects the mixture of these qualities of coldness and dryness, or whatever it may be in a different climate, which in effect will cause and produce different physical characteristics, as well as moral characteristics or mental qualities. So because this is an important topic in the early history of racializing thought, I was wondering, in your sources in the Renaissance era, did you see this type of thinking being applied to kind of racializing thinking? And follow-up to this would also be that since Galen thought that it was exactly the perfect balanced climate of Greece that produced the Eucratic, the best mixed characters, in other words, the most mentally and physically balanced individuals. So would the Renaissance authors in Italy say that, okay, in Italy we have the best climate? Or how do the climate and environmental conversations continue?
So you're quite right, of course, that in the ancient philosophical traditions and medical traditions, race was conceptualized in different ways than we do now. And the view that you mention is, I think, the predominant one. That is that we can distinguish peoples according to their environments, and in particular according to the climates of the places in which they live, because those climates purportedly affect the character, again, both the moral and the intellectual character of peoples. And because that argument seems also to rely on claims about heat and cold and the effects they have on our character, you would expect that people arguing about the effect of temperature on the character of the sexes might also take this argument into consideration. So I have seen one Renaissance author, Lucrezia Marinella, does explicitly take up the claims of some other authors, because I think this theory was still very widespread in the Renaissance. As so often, they're appealing to ancient literature and ancient philosophy and ancient medicine for views about their contemporary world. And Marinella, when she appeals to this, appeals to it not so much because she's interested in understanding how we should think about different peoples or what we might think of as race, but because she wants to show that if we want to explain the purported character of some peoples as different from those of others by appeal to the environment, that's going to have to intersect in problematic ways with claims about heat and cold determining the characteristics of the sexes. Because, of course, if you take a person from Asia Minor and move them into Italy, you would expect that their temperature would change if it's the environment that's affecting that, and hence that their character might change. But if we're meanwhile claiming that really what distinguishes men and women is the degree of heat in their bodies, then it would seem that some people would be transitioning from male to female as they moved from one place to another. Or that someone who was a woman in one context would be a man in another. since temperature is always relative. So when Marinella invokes this, again, she does so not, I think, because she's particularly interested in the question of extending the question of, if there are illegitimate distinctions being drawn between men and women, are there not also illegitimate distinctions being drawn between Europeans and Asians, say? So what I have not seen, at least in the texts I've read from the querelle in the Renaissance, I have not seen people drawing explicit connections between divisions of sex and divisions of race.
And would they still continue the ancient tradition of considering the Greek climate?
Oh, right.
It
would seem to follow, but again, what's interesting is I haven't read an Italian saying clearly the Italian climate is the best. That's perhaps in part because, well, I was going to say, but this might be wrong. I was going to say that might be because they're living in city-states effectively, and they don't often think of themselves, I think, as Italian. They think of themselves as Venetian or Florentine, but not so much as Italian. But it would also have been true that ancient Greeks were not thinking of themselves primarily as Greek so much as, Athenian or Spartan. Now, that changes somewhat as people begin to think about race in terms of language, right? So notoriously in the ancient world, the distinction is really drawn between being Greek and being barbarian, where that's a linguistic distinction in the first instance. But I haven't seen anything to suggest that Italians think that the Italian climate is peculiarly good for rendering a person morally and intellectually superior to others. No.
But the physiognomic tradition and the environmental determinism as theories seem to live on.
They do live on, that's clear, yeah.
So you are touching on these topics also in your recent article to this Routledge Handbook that I have over here, the Routledge Handbook of Women and Ancient Greek Philosophy, edited by Sara Brill and McKeen, on which I also had the honor to be collaborating. And here in your article entitled The Worth of Women, the Reception of Ancient Debates in the Renaissance, you discuss some of the previous topics we have been touching on, but also the more political questions, particularly concerning the role of tyranny. And the Renaissance authors you show were reading closely Plato's and Aristotle's descriptions of the tyrant. And since this seems both as an interesting and a topical question to me, I was wondering if you could tell more about why the tyrant became an important figure in the Renaissance feminist debates.
Right. So I'll start by saying what the Renaissance pro-woman authors are really using from ancient philosophy to describe who the tyrant is. So in Aristotle, 2 points really distinguish the tyrant. One is that the tyrant is no better than, or possibly worse than, the people over whom he exercises power. And the other is that the tyrant is exercising that power in pursuit of his own interests and not with a concern for the interests of the people that he is governing. So, and then from Plato, what the pro-woman authors draw that I think is really helpful for them is the idea that our desires, and in particular our appetites and our desire for revenge, are characteristic desires of the tyrant, which is one reason that we should suppress them so far as possible on the Platonic view. So the Renaissance feminists take this depiction of the tyrant as someone who is no better than us, quite possibly worse than us, who has his own interests at heart, and who has these excessive and mistaken desires for his own dominance. That they want to claim exactly depicts what men are like in their relation to women. And I think one reason they make this kind of argument is precisely that they think, I'm thinking especially of the Venetians and others who think they're living in republics. They think, look, the men in my audience already believe that tyranny is a bad thing. So if I can convince them, and if I can convince the women around them, that the kind of rule they're exercising over women is not legitimate, but is precisely tyrannical and illegitimate, then I can convince them that it's wrong, right? That women should be entitled to govern themselves, and even, the feminists would argue, better suited to govern other people because of their cooler temperature, better grasp of moral principles, and greater concern for other people as they make decisions morally and politically. So Sabrina Ebersmeyer is another scholar who has written about the importance of these claims the Renaissance feminists are making about the tyranny of men, that it's a very explicitly political argument intended to show that what a lot of people at the time, and some people continue to believe, is a legitimate exercise of power over women, is in fact not that. And that if you just reflect on what it means, you will see that that's true. That's their idea.
In your sources, did you ever see them apply this argument to slavery?
So slavery comes up a lot. I think I want to say two things about this. The pro-woman authors pretty routinely compare the situation of women under male dominance to the situation of slaves. And I think there are at least two questions to think about here. One is, what exactly do they mean by that? So is that a metaphor? I don't think it is a metaphor. I think that they mean quite literally that the political status of women resembles that of slaves. Now, what kind of slaves do they have in mind is the question. So I think that by and large, they are thinking of political slavery. So their point is, just as someone who is a political slave can be interfered with, can have their decisions co-opted by a master at any point, so too women don't enjoy the kind of autonomy that a free man would. But there's some evidence that our colleague here on Martina Reuter's project, Mary Jo MacDonald, who's one of the postdocs working on it, she was telling me about evidence later from the 17th century of women who pretty clearly thought women are like slaves, where the slaves they had in mind were actually chattel slaves. So I think there's quite a lot of work to be done still on figuring out the details of these arguments that draw parallels between the state women find themselves in and the state that slaves find themselves in. Since slavery, of course, takes different forms in different places at different times, and the people who are enslaved can be, of course, quite different. So that's one point, is if the claim that women are treated as slaves, although they are not slaves, one point is what kind of slaves, political slaves or chattel slaves. But another question that I think comes up is and this relates back to your question about environmental determinism, is can any of the people advocating male dominance over women and also advocating for slavery, if they are trying to give a physiological justification for those two forms of dominance, that is, if they are claiming there is something about the bodies of women or the bodies of some people who they might call natural slaves that makes them such that they should be subject to the authority of another person, how are we going to explain those physical or physiological determinants? And again, my view is it's very hard for them to make a coherent argument that certain physiological features characterize someone as a woman and certain other physiological features might characterize someone as a natural slave, and that in either of those cases that would justify the kind of dominance that was politically normal in the Renaissance. So I think that's a problem for them, which is good.
And when working with the history of feminist philosophy, what would you think is the feminist argument in the Renaissance, at least? Is it extended to criticize slavery, or are they two separate arguments, or are they even like connected?
The feminists, so the pro-woman authors that I'm reading, are not critical of the enslavement of other peoples. And that seems to me both disappointing and common in the history of feminist philosophy, that those arguing for the worth of women, or later on the rights of women, are preoccupied with the situation of women in whatever place they find themselves in. And even as you would expect people who are saying, it is shocking that you're treating us like you treat the slaves, you might expect them to say, moreover, it's shocking the way you're treating the slaves, and they fail to do that in a way that I think is reminiscent of feminists at the turn of the 20th century arguing that it is shocking that women don't have the vote because you're putting us in the same category as, say, the insane or mental deficients, as they would have called them. And they don't follow that up by saying, moreover, it's shocking that you deprive people of their political rights for these trivial reasons. They just focus on getting for women what women might need. So I don't see in the Renaissance, or later on, often in the history of feminist arguments, the extension of the claims for political entitlements that women and their male sympathizers are making for women. I don't see those extended to other peoples as often as we might expect to see it, at any rate.
As you are talking now, it is obvious to me that while you are an expert in ancient and Renaissance philosophy and the history of philosophy, many of the topics you are working with seem extremely topical to many conversations today. And I would like to ask about your book, Aristotle on Sexual Difference, Metaphysics, Biology, and Politics, because there in the first chapter you make the point that a detailed study on Aristotle helps us to understand not only the ancient debates, but also many debates concerning gender and equality that are still ongoing. And I was wondering if you would like to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Well, there's a very general or schematic way in which I think the ancient debates, which are taken up in the Renaissance, are still evident in how some people think about the differences between men and women. And so in particular, this idea that there will be features of a person's body that features of, say, a female body that make it such that the person should be gendered in a certain way. That view, which many people continue to hold, seems to me to emerge from this tradition of trying to think through sexual difference and to ground it in certain bodily features. What's really interesting, of course, is that what changes quite drastically over the course of history is which features of the body people think mark it off as feminine or masculine. So for Aristotle, it really was temperature. It was not so much anatomical features, like having a uterus, that made someone a woman. But the idea then is, I think, that misogynists are often looking for some feature of a woman's body that they can claim gives rise to certain dispositions, psychological, intellectual, moral, that mark her off as feminine, and typically mark her off as someone who should not hold political power, and should not be able to determine the lives of men in any way. So that's a very general sort of pattern of argument that I think we see repeated from the ancient world into now, this claim that women's bodies somehow disable them for political activities and political office. And then if I can appeal to a more popular kind of trope, I was thinking about Tradwives, who are traditional wives, who you can find on a lot of social media now, advocating for a certain form of marriage where they claim the wife embraces, well, both husband and wife are to embrace what they call traditional gender roles, where that means that it is the job of a man, of the husband, to protect his wife and his family and to support them materially, economically. And it is the task of the wife to maintain a home and to submit to her husband. What I find interesting about current Tradwives is the insistence that this submission of wife to husband is not based on men having a higher value than women. They will claim women are just as valuable as men are. It's just that a husband should exercise authority over his wife. And they typically base this in an appeal to biblical claims. But it's clear to me that we can trace it back to the kind of ambivalent attitude towards women that we find in Aristotle, who does want to say that women are valuable, that we should preserve sexual difference, that this difference between men and women is itself socially and politically a good thing, but that women are inferior to men. So it is not obvious that that's a coherent position to hold, and I find that incoherence emerging in the Tradwife stuff, because they want to say, no, women are good, just like men, and yet they should submit to men. And I don't see how you can justify submission to another person without invoking some claim to that person having an advantage in some way. So I'm not claiming, of course, that Tradwives believe that they are drawing on Aristotle to support their view, but I do think we can trace that view back to ancient philosophy and see it emerging yet again.
But I agree. I was also thinking, because in my contribution to this same volume, I draw on the ancient conversation on economics, and recently reading some media posts on the Tradwives made me also reflect on how the ancient conversation on economics still seems quite topical to analyze. this kind of
Yeah.
phenomenon as the Tradwives is. So I find this extremely interesting, what you are saying. But finally, Marguerite, I have really enjoyed the conversation with you, and I would finally like just to ask you, what are you going to work on next?
Okay. Thanks, Malin. I've enjoyed it too. So I have a project that I've been working on for a while with a collaborator, Lara Harwood-Ventura, and that is a volume of translations of these Renaissance texts, mostly from Italian into English, some French into English, and one Latin into English, because I think these works are philosophically really interesting and an important piece of the history of feminist philosophy, but these texts have been unavailable to Anglophone readers. So we are translating and editing those texts, and that will come out with Oxford, I hope, next year, maybe the year after. The other thing I'm working on are a couple of papers, one on the malleability of human nature in these feminist texts of the Renaissance, where one thing I'm struck by and want to figure out better are often these authors seem open to the idea that a person might transition from being a woman to a man, that might happen simply through age, that men become more feminine as they become older, which is a view you can find at least implicit in some ancient texts. It seems to become more explicit in the Renaissance. But also the view that you might transition, some things could happen to your body that would allow you to go from being female to male or male to female. So I want to think about how the extent to which the Renaissance authors seem to think that while we are born with a nature, that nature can, through education, through the inculcation of certain customs or habits, become something different. And what that suggests about political possibilities then for making people what we might want them to be. And then there's another paper I want to write on lists of illustrious women and what they are doing. So in many, many, many treatises on the worth of women in the Renaissance, we find appended, or as one of the books within a work, lists of notable women who can be both historical and fictional. And I used to skip over those. I always find what's really interesting is when you realize you've been not paying attention to something because of a preconceived idea about what is interesting. In this case, I always assumed it's the arguments that are interesting, so the list of women will be incidental to that. But in fact, now I think quite a lot of philosophical work is being carried by those lists of women, because I want to look at what virtues exactly are being highlighted in the women in these lists. Do those virtues correspond to certain ideals of political capacity? And so that's one question. How are the features of these women that are supposed to be excellent, how do those relate to political excellence? Another thing I want to think about is illustrious women as exceptions and illustrious women as the norms. Because I think a lot of people, again, throughout the history of feminist arguments, have been prepared to say, well, sure, some women might be exceptional, but most women actually are over-emotional, incapable of rule, silly. So sure, you can trot out a few exceptional women, but that doesn't defeat the general rule. But I don't think these lists of illustrious women are supposed to be exceptions. Because one thing about them is they go on and on and on. And you might think that's tedious, but you might also think that's making a philosophical point about the huge range of women who have in fact demonstrated, in particular, constancy, level-headedness, practical wisdom, these features that make one excel, in fact, at governance and make one well-suited to it. So I think there's something there. Anyway, those are the projects I'm thinking about at the moment.
And I really look forward to reading the results once they come out.
Thanks,
Thank
Malin.
you so much for this conversation today, Marguerite. It was a real pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, thank you, Malin. Really great.